All right, well, welcome back. We're going to talk about portfolio assessments today. And portfolio assessments, we're going to be taking a look at why you might use them, what they are, how you might consider grading them, and sort of the time and the requirements that go into a good portfolio assessment. Okay, so portfolio assessments have this sort of historical focus, which we're going to talk about in a few slides, but for right now, we're looking at a 21st century portfolio system, and we find that e-portfolios are actually really good business model idea, where we have all the standards for teaching posted. Those are very well known. We have FEEPs, of course. And then we have the assignments you had to do and your work, and the work that goes into the portfolio being your exemplary work and how it matches the content standards and the sort of things that you should know, so that you have a really round and a pretty good understanding of the student's ability to do something. Or so, for example, if it's teaching, you might have a whole bunch of your test scores for, actually passing your, general practice and content area exam. You might have pieces of work from your content area saying that here is my ability to do this task. So maybe it's, essays on something, or here's my amount of hours in the lab. These are some of my qualifications, and these are some of the grades and work that came out of fulfilling those qualifications. And then here's me in practice. Here, I went out to the school, and these are the evaluations that the mentor wrote for me, so that you would have a full sort of portfolio of work to show a potential employer. So that's always sort of the goal in portfolios, is that you have some sort of global, multi-triangulated sources of evidence feeding into this one thing that are then useful for some purpose. We're generally not creating a portfolio just for the sake of creating a portfolio. Generally, it's for some other purpose, such as a potential employer, or showing parents' work, or showing the school board that you are getting your students through the curriculum. There's always some reason for doing this. Okay, so we talk about the historical aspect of this. We come out of professional portfolios. So I guess in a sense, this is newer than like multiple choice, but older than performance-based assessments, insofar as hitting the everyday school curriculum goes. Portfolio assessments in general are really old. You'd have portfolios of work from like printing press men or artists. They would bring their portfolio of work to job interviews and as such. So that's where this sort of idea came from, and they sort of have a sense of authenticness to them, because they are legitimately used like that. Even to this day, you have portfolios of work. Like if you go to get a teaching job, you bring a portfolio, you have your CV, and you bring your different types of works that you've done, and that's your portfolio. I mean, that speaks of your abilities and showcases how you work, your interests, and what you know. So they're still used today, but when we think of authentic assessments, we generally think of performance-based assessments rather than portfolios. I have had the unique experience of having some distinct portfolios in my tenure as a student, both as a graduate student and as a just a regular student in a normal school. I've experienced portfolios, but I've also had some of my students tell me that they've never had to do a portfolio ever. So that's kind of a strange to me, and so I wonder about your experience. So if you think back, did you ever have to compile a bunch of work into a single, like a 3-ring binder or a single notebook, and have to compile test scores or projects or notes or unit stuff? Because that was all a portfolio, but I didn't know it to be called as such when I was doing it. So I think it's interesting how some teachers really enjoy using these and some just don't. And so for that purpose, I have put in a video. The web link is on Blackboard for you to see portfolios in action. And the video is a really good one of a teacher describing to you the work that is in a social science, I believe it's 11th grade history. Oh, the subject, I'm forgetting. I'm pretty sure it's American history. But just that, believe the instructor is teaching 11th grade, so that portfolios are not limited to younger grade levels. They can transition throughout. It's just another tool in your toolkit for you to consider when you're completing lessons. Okay. They came out of architecture, advising art, photography, journalism, and I think that that's pretty well explained. What might not be as noticeable is that they can be tweaked for the audience that they are going to be viewed by. So what I mean by that is that in the more professional ones, like for my teaching portfolio, depending on who I was trying to interview with and get a job with, I might rearrange my portfolio to better suit what they might be looking for. So that's something to keep in mind. And then also the structure should be controlled by the owner, so by your student, but with guidance from you. So this is the part that's a little strange. In the classroom, that doesn't work out as nicely and neatly, because insofar as grading goes, these things can be a nightmare if there isn't some standard formatting to them between students. So I would say that, okay, sure, there is some flexibility there. Like some students take really meticulous notes, and if you're including notes in your portfolio, then constraining students to a single page of notes might not be. It might be fine for some students, but it might not be nearly enough for others. So have some flexibility to it, but I would have some legitimate formatting going on in that portfolio so that you stand a chance of being able to get through them quickly. Okay, so the idea behind them is that you're trying to support evidence for grades. And this is another way to triangulate on a objective that you are trying to measure. So here's this information for completing this objective, and I've got 3 different ways I've had the students do this. I've had them write about it, I've had them draw it, and I've had them do some sort of performance on it. So I might have the checklist from the performance that I graded them on. I might have, the copy of the work and then my feedback to them included, and I might then have feedback on the drawing. That's all distinctly possible. That's 3 ways of evidence about the mastery of the skill set, and it's growing the student's achievement in the skill set. So what you find generally is that you generally have take this back for a second. In the classroom, if you're doing them throughout a semester, what you might find is that you do a sort of initial skill inventory at the beginning and post that into the very front cover of the portfolio, and then you do one at the end. and then you can see growth, and then you can also see growth as you go through the different projects and the pieces of evidence that you've put into the portfolio, and you can showcase growth in multiple ways, more than just a number. Here's all this work. Look at the progress that they have made throughout the semester. And that's a really cool thing. That being said, portfolios do not have to be an entire semester. They can be just a unit. They don't have to be a huge, unyieldly, cumbersome thing. They can just be small and defined. You might decide that you have a unit that really lends itself well to portfolios, in which case, then sure, fine, why not? And some might make absolutely no sense to be used as portfolios. I would think that you should think long and hard about portfolios before you just suddenly adopt them, because they are a lot of work. But they're worth it if you're willing to put in the work, right? So we take a look at validity of these sort of things. They show a big variety of learning that's occurring throughout the semester. So you have a pretty good representation of this student's skill set. And you should have a rubric for everything that's being graded that went into portfolio, and also one for the portfolio itself. So that's something that I was not particularly aware of at the time when I was actually a student and having these graded, but there was a portfolio assessment period, like there's just one, and I wasn't particularly aware of it, but that all this work, which I had grades for, went into this portfolio. I didn't realize at the end that it too was going to be graded as a whole thing. So that was me as a student. I wasn't particularly aware of that, but that is something that you should consider if you're going to do this whole process. There's supposed to be some sort of rubric at the end of it for grading the portfolio. And the relevance factor of this is very important, because it's very easy to just stick everything in the portfolio, but that's not really the purpose generally. Generally, you're supposed to be assessing just a few things, and you're supposed to pick from a huge, you can do many things in your classroom in a given period. So you need to pick out the very best things that are most representative of the skills to go into that portfolio. So they should definitely be cherry-picked, and they should represent the work, but not maybe include every piece. Okay. I don't need to read this to you, but in general, you're trying to identify students' strengths rather than weaknesses. The point of this is not to point out that, oh, this student is a bad student. Here's their mediocre writing samples and stuff. That is not the point. The point is to try and show progression over time. And so, okay, well maybe you started out and you were really struggling with your writing. Well, at the end of the semester, perhaps your writing is now on par with the rest of your peers. That is sort of the idea that you want to show, that you are getting better. So the feedback that you would leave to students is always going to be in a more positive tone. You need to really think hard about the sort of feedback you give to students. Anyways, just in general, positive feedback is always really appreciated. As not that you tell them they're doing a good job when they're not, but maybe you are being kind about how you tell them they need to spend more time doing this, or have you considered doing a draft before you write or something like that. And that's definitely supposed to be suggestive. You're supposed to be suggesting ways to improve more than just pointing out that something isn't right. Okay. Oh no, I went backwards. All right, so characteristics of portfolios. What can we assess with portfolios? I unfortunately recorded a piece about this already, and I think I might have just lost it. But in general, You can assess just about anything with portfolios. You can put in test grades. You can put in performance-based assessment rubrics. You can put in, if you're using a digital one, you can put in audio sound clips. Like for if you're learning a foreign language, you can record the students speaking, which is pretty cool. You can record video. You can take photographs. You can put in pieces of work, original pieces of writing, lab reports. You can do whatever you want with portfolios. Sky's the limit, really. You just have to be creative about it sometimes, about what something represents. So if you are going to do something like a performance assessment as an element of the portfolio, then you need to put in the guidelines for the performance assessment and the rubrics and stuff, because there's not going to be an actual piece of work there for anyone to see. So it's sometimes a little harder to understand what exactly you were looking at with the performance assessment, because you can't see the actual performance, of course, in a portfolio. But for the most part, sky's the limit, really. Okay, so insofar as drawbacks go, there are decidedly some drawbacks, because these can be huge. So if you look at the YouTube video I linked, that binder, not really a binder, it's like a workbook, but it's huge. So if you're collecting work over an entire semester or entire school year, that can be a pretty hefty journal or portfolio that you end up with, which, if you're on the receiving end of all that and you're supposed to somehow take it in, can be a little overwhelming for both other teachers and for parents. They don't even know where to start. What am I looking at? What was the point of this? So just, be aware that if you're going to do that, you might want to have them start with, well, most portfolios at least, they have a pre and post sort of assessment in them. And you might want to start out with identifying that, and then how they were assembled and the progression of work that the students did. Please be aware that these things are time intensive. If it is not being a time intensive thing for you, then it is probably not being done correctly. In general, okay, so I say that, but it's not maybe where you think the time is being spent. So actually putting these things together is like nothing. There's no big deal there. But this review, the student-teacher review and the weekly review, that's where the time goes. And it's a very valuable piece of time, I would say, because during this, you are having students select the best pieces of work for that week on the topic to be added to the portfolio. And if you and the student disagree about what's the best piece of their work for the week, it might be a good opportunity to really discuss the skills that one piece is lacking, or the direction that the student needs to be going in for improvement. So that can be a very valuable time for student-teacher interaction. But it is something that is very much so a time killer. Okay, so when we actually design them, we were thinking of a purpose in mind. There's generally a reason. You don't just willy-nilly decide you're doing a performance assessment, a portfolio assessment. And you have to communicate with the teachers that are in your sort of area as well. Because it's a little strange if your classroom is doing one and someone else teaching the same grade level is not. That is a little strange, but it's okay depending on your administration, how much freedom they give you over your classroom. But you need to communicate that with parents, that you're doing a portfolio of their students' work. And you have to really, just ultimately decide on why you're doing something. Just like when you create a test and you think of, well, what am I assessing and why am I assessing it? That's the same thing here. You're picking a purpose for the portfolio. And then you're going to start identifying, just like you would for any sort of testing thing, what am I actually documenting? What sort of levels of achievement am I supposed to document? So should I be capturing their math abilities from addition to multiplication? Or are we hitting on group work? Are we doing both? It's hard to say. But you should go into this having identified what are the most important skills that the students should know walking out. All right, so you think about planning purposes. It's generally you, just be front upright here. Insofar as planning the portfolio for the lower grades, as it were, it is generally the teacher that's planning the portfolio. Students have a great deal of input in portfolios for most of them. Like they decide what pieces of work go in them. But insofar as that you need a piece of, like you need an extended writing piece, or you need a portfolio, you need drawings in the portfolio or something like that. That's you're deciding that. Stakeholders generally don't care that much unless it's unless you're in sort of like a magnet school where they're geared more towards arts or something, and so they're going to want an art portfolio, and they'll sort of want skills displayed. Stakeholders generally don't put that much input into the conversation, and parents may have legitimately some things that they want in the portfolio, but it's been my experience that parents are kind of just willing to go with whatever you want to do in your classroom. As long as it's, their students going to be treated fairly and all that stuff. So that's about it insofar as the parent front. Insofar as what you include and how many things you include, well, you want a fairly representative body of work representing the students. So you want there to be quite a few pieces of work on the same thing, but in different modes. So a multimodal experience of this skill set. So it's really up to you. I would say you'd want to be selective. You might only want 2 of something or 3 of something. They're short. But no matter what you're doing, you're going to want to include the instructions in the rubric for how they were actually graded. Okay, so what does performance look like here? And for this sort of thing, you generally have an end grade associated with the portfolio. And so you have to have a pretty well-formulated idea of what in the world mastery looks like for a portfolio. Because that seems really strange. Like, how do you master a portfolio? Well, you have to have, this many you have to have every week or something, and you have to have something in place for if a student gets sick, that you have some sort of way to accommodate that. That's something that you need to make sure that you have written into your procedure, just in case, some students get sick for weeks, and so they miss out on whole sections of work, so their portfolio might be missing that, so they shouldn't be penalized even more for missing work when they were sick. But in general, you should have a big rubric, should have it completely explained on what earned you points and what took away from points. And ideally that you would have a log of progress. I've only seen this a couple of times. I've not experienced it for myself, but insofar as that goes, like an observations from you, the teacher, on the student's progress that you add in, that you write at various points of the semester, but you don't add in until later. is generally the practice that I've seen. Insofar as the procedure for the portfolio, that there's some sort of final score, you're looking at the whole thing, and you're rating the entire portfolio. Okay, so insofar as logistics go, you have to think about these things at the front of the assessment. Timeline-wise, when are you going to start? When are you going to introduce it? When are you going to tell everyone? When are you going to grade it? When in the week are you going to do these reviews? How does the actual procedure go for actually creating it? Where are you going to store these things? Because they get pretty heavy. Who is going to have access to them? Parents are going to be probably very interested in who is going to have access to them. And then the conferencing thing, that's what I meant by the amount of time it takes to do this sort of activity. And then that is the link to the YouTube video regarding an interesting example of a portfolio. All right, so in your classroom, I want you to be thinking about how you create a rubric for a complete portfolio, because that is a sticky point, even for me. Without figuring out exactly what sort of things that are going into the portfolio, it's going to be really hard to just think of a good rubric for one. But you are going to want to justify what you're assessing insofar as completeness of the portfolio. So you're going to have a really good idea of going into it, what you were trying to assess and why you were trying to assess it, and the sort of guidelines that you gave to students. Because if you didn't give them the appropriate guidelines, you can't you can't mark them against not doing something that you didn't really ask them to do, is what I'm trying to say. So these are all things you should really be considering before you ever even start the activity. And I think you should definitely consider using portfolios in your classroom. Just give it a shot. I wouldn't maybe say that the whole semester is required. You might just want to start off with a unit. So maybe, a 4-week unit on something, just to get your feet wet and give it a shot. Students are generally really proud of their portfolios when they create their work and they can see how they've progressed over time. So definitely a worthy use of your time in a classroom.